Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cynthia Weaver with the Evidence-Based Practice Group at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. I'll serve as your moderator today. We appreciate you being with us for this next installment of our ongoing Leading with Evidence series. I'm really looking forward to an inspiring and thoughtful discussion today from our panelists as we learn more about how a new tool can help us better understand the mechanisms that promote healing from violence and why this is so important. Next slide, please. The Annie E. Casey Foundation began offering the Leading with Evidence webinar series in 2018. These webinars offer practitioners, system leaders, practical ways to immediately apply evidence-informed programs and practices in your work. This allows you to gain more clarity about how you do what you do. For researchers, advocates, and fellow funders, these webinars offer opportunities to better understand how evidence-based programs and practices can improve outcomes for youth and young adults. Next slide, please. Today, you'll hear from our panelists about why, how, and to what benefit they developed and are using the new Healing from Community Violence scale. You'll also hear how another Casey investment is supporting equitable access to this new tool through a cloud-based data collection platform that's free to users. If your organization wants to use this tool as part of your programming, it will be available very soon, but more about that later in our presentation. Next slide, please. We're so excited to host a panel of folks who have created the new community scale for healing from violence possibilities. Welcome to Danielle Sered, the founder and executive director of Common Justice and the author of the 2019 book, Until We Reck. Common Justice has been a Casey grantee since 2017. Their work in the field of restorative justice continues to shed light on the intersectionality between harmed parties and responsible parties. Common Justice develops and advances solutions to violence that meet the needs of those harmed, advance racial equity, and do not rely on incarceration. Also, welcome to Richard D. Smith, co-founder of Glob al LLC. Richard is a healing strategist and trauma expert dedicated to empowering young people of color and marginalized communities. And also welcome to Anna Ortega-Williams, assistant professor of social work with City University of New York's Hunter College School of Social Work. Anna is a scholar, practitioner, and researcher focused on healing historical trauma and promoting post-traumatic growth and youth development. I think it's really important that all three of our panelists were actively involved in a user-centered participatory action design process to develop the healing scale from 2019 to 2023. They worked with lived experience program participants and staff from the Center for Nonviolence and Social Justice, HOLA, Homeboy Industries, the MAID Institute, the Love More Movement, and Reimagining Justice. Next slide, please. So let's talk about communicating during the webinar. We'll go over some important housekeeping details that'll help us with this. After we hear from our presenters, we'll all have some time for questions. We'll keep our attendees on mute throughout the webinar. We ask that you submit your questions by entering them into the Q&A window in the middle of the bottom of your Zoom screen. See where it's circled in this slide. You can submit a question there to the panelists at any time during the webinar, and then we'll answer as many questions as we can during Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you're in full screen mode and want to ask a question, you may need to return to the event window by using the drop-down controls at the top of your screen. And I'll also mention that this presentation is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be available to you later via email follow-up from us. We also encourage you to feel free to share these materials with others. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Casey's evidence-based practice group supports taking proven solutions to scale across organizations serving young people. This is why supporting development of and equitable access to the community scale for healing from violence is so important to our group. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at this slide and consider our discussion today. When we think about investing in evidence building, so we're looking at the green panel on the far left of the slide, helping professionals can use the healing skill that you'll learn about during this webinar to better understand and measure and respond to individual participant progress. Progress that's based on what survivor-centered programs and their participants value, the journey toward healing. In the middle box, let's look at adapting and replicating. As part of replication, or making the healing tool available to as many programs as possible, the scale will be available in a cloud-based format at no cost to users. I mentioned this earlier, and we'll talk about this a little more later. The format includes automated data analysis and data dashboard visualizations for program-level data. Our hope is that this provides community-based providers to engage in continuous quality improvement in the implementation of their programs and adapt as necessary based on the needs of the populations they serve. And finally, when we look at the yellow box to the far right, this program-level data helps organizations and larger networks of survivor-centered programs make the case for future investments in practices and programs that support healing from violence. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. At this point, it is my great pleasure to turn our presentation over to Danielle, Richard, and Anna.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you to everybody who's joining us today. We know your time is so valuable, and we so appreciate your spending it with us. I'll talk some about the origins of the scale and pass it along to Anna and to Richard to give you a much deeper sense of its development and its use. I have the privilege of serving as the executive director for Common Justice, where we've worked with survivors since 2009, survivors of serious violence. And in the course of our work, we wanted to measure the impact of our healing work on the survivors whom we served. And in doing that, the thing we found most clearly was that the scales didn't work. They didn't work for a number of reasons. First, the language was wrong, and it alienated people. It didn't align with the lived experience or diction of the people who were being asked questions about their well-being. Second, the scales almost universally presumed a single event from which someone was healing. And the reality for our participants is they had suffered many kinds of harm many times, and no single event rose to the top as the one we were addressing. And of course, the nature of trauma is not that one event provokes a certain symptom and another provokes another, but rather that those experiences become inextricably intertwined. The third is that those scales had no means to account for intervening traumatic events. So if between the first time we administered it and the next, somebody experienced new loss or other kinds of harm, there was no way to account for that in the measurement. And last, they had no means to account for chronic trauma, including the continuous exposure of violence, deprivation, inequity, hostile policing, and more that reflect the reality for so many people in America, particularly in Black and Brown communities. And so this meant that the scales either didn't work at all, meaning the people didn't even participate in the first round of administration, or the results were entirely distorted. They would sometimes show increased traumatic symptoms over the baseline if we were even able to administer it 2 times. A, because people experience new traumatic events, and B, because through our support combating the normalization of violence, people began to finally identify their symptoms as trauma and to name them out loud without shame, which resulted in reporting more rather than fewer symptoms over time. And then also because C, over time, their primary symptom, numbness, would sometimes begin to recede through a process of healing, and then other symptoms would rise to the level of their lived experience. So we understand, we know that many of the symptoms of trauma will persist until we end the systemic inequities that drive and exacerbate all of them. But we also know there is something positive that can and does happen after harm. There are ways in which people find ways to continue to thrive. We know that people in virtually all conditions heal. And so we asked, what if instead of measuring the absence of trauma, we measured the presence of healing? What if instead of seeking less of something bad, such as hypervigilance, which to a certain degree might be a necessary way for Black people to live in this moment in America, what if instead of that we sought the presence of something good? What if we started to ask, what are the indicators of healing and can we measure them? Early on, people talked about healing as moving past self-blame, finding connection with others rather than isolation in the aftermath of harm, becoming capable of feeling joy, not instead of sorrow, but alongside it. We know that these dimensions of healing exist, and they can and continue to grow even in the context of chronic trauma, even in the context of new intervening traumatic events. Even if someone experiences a second loss, with healing, they can more quickly seek help. They can internalize their pain less. They can connect their suffering to the suffering of others. They can see themselves as worthy and as capable of being whole, even as their bodies display the inevitable symptoms of PTSD for some time. Their experience, the truth, becomes different when they are also healing. And so we wanted to measure all these things that we could all see. We knew two things going into it. First, that the right people to create a measure would be people who had lived experience of this kind of violence. We're incredibly proud to say this is the first scale we know of in the US, developed exclusively by people of color, and which such foundational contributions from indirectly impacted people. And second, we knew we'd have to start by defining what we mean by these key words, including community violence and healing itself. Next slide. So the group, and you'll hear more from Richard and Anna about how this came about, but the group came to a definition of community violence as harm that happens in a community to individuals and groups of people. Key dimensions of it are that it is fueled by past pain and oppression. It shuts down views of the future, and it creates personal harm and ruptures community. A couple things to pull out about this definition as it differs from other definitions you may know. First is the way in which it thinks about both past and future, that it understands violence as temporarily situated in a way that healing will find is as well. And that it also reflects an expansiveness beyond an understanding of individuals. It understands the way violence moves in community and through relationship. Next, please. We also had to define healing. The definition that you'll hear more about, and you'll hear really about what comprises it, is that healing from community violence is getting to the core of the harm and reclaiming possibilities. You'll hear about elements of this when we talk about getting to the core, meaning navigating to where the pain is and what it's about, and doing that in relationship. Reclaiming possibilities and hope, that healing is a process of wresting the future from the past. Developing faith in the healing process. That includes one's deservedness to heal and the notion that healing is even possible for anyone, including oneself. And then trusting the community in that healing. And this really critically situates healing in a larger collective context, whether that's family members, service providers, neighbors, or others who are on similar healing journeys. And so it's my huge pleasure now to pass it to my wonderful colleague, Richard Smith, to talk about how the partnership developed for the healing scale. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Danielle. So in 2019, the summer of 2019, Danielle came to me and told me about this vision to create this scale, and then entrusted me to lead the process. I was the doctoral student at the time, and I was known as the researcher. However, being a 12th year doctoral student with many leaves of absence and challenges in the process, I took this on, hopeful, understanding the importance of it and the need for us to create something that captures our reality, but not really knowing how to do it. A couple months before that, Danielle had introduced me to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Anna Ortega Williams. who had recently defended her dissertation. And after that conversation with Danielle about the vision and taking it on, she was the first person that I decided to turn to for help, to say, I don't know how we're going to do this, but we have to do it. And all of the way that this took place was just totally alignment, and spirit was in movement in this process. Because after that first meeting with Anna, she talked about a friend or a colleague or a new colleague, Dr. Alexis Jamal. And then we shortly thereafter realized that we had another person in common, our dear friend and lovely sister, Jennifer Lopez. And so we took this on, and it's so timely because in the spirit of Women's History Month, you know, these powerful, passionate warrior sisters of mine and I led this process of going through the stages that it would take to develop this scale. And then we realized that we couldn't do this alone and we needed other partners from the community. And so in 2019, we hosted our event, the Trauma, Healing, and Organizational Wisdom Exchange in a classroom in CUNY School of Social Work. And we had over 30 people there from various organizations that participated in this discussion. There were local folks, but the main folks who were part of it, and I'm going to name their names. We had Dr. Bruce Purnell from the Love More movement. We had Lisa Chaudhry and Jason Davis from Reimagining Justice. We had people zooming in like Leon Elamine from the Made Institute and Michael Laron from Homeboy Industry. And then we had folks like Corey Green and A-Rock and several of their other young people from their youth organizing committee participate in this conversation. And this conversation produced insight on the questions that we ask. What is healing? What does it look like? What does it act like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? And we left there with an abundance of information that we distilled, and that became the basis of the questions that these courageous folks who were our partners throughout this process, throughout every aspect and step of the process of developing this skill, took on the task of engaging in community discussions or focus groups and talking to people in their respective communities, because these organizations represent a variety of different geographical locations from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. And the thing that I also want to lift up is that the next year, COVID happened. And all of the people who were our partners, who I just named, were the essential workers who were literally engaging in mutual aid and trying to support the healing journeys of the young people that they were working with, the folks that they were working with, simultaneously investing their time and effort in this process of helping to define the meaning of healing, right? To identify the indicators, and then to conduct an exploratory factor analysis, right? To test the validity and reliability for the measure. And these folks sacrificed their time. And I want to say this because this process was more than just a participatory process. It was a healing-centered process. And we all supported each other throughout this. Some of us lost the lives of loved ones. Many of them lost the lives of young people and people that they were working with. But we had each other. So we often say that this process was healing just as much for us as it was for the people that we were working with. Next slide. And so we came out of these focus groups and this organizational wisdom process where we exchanged information and heard from folks. And we were intentional about honoring the stories of the folks who were directly impacted, the people who had the lived experiences and the connection and the proximity to the issues to be able to give us the insight and that we needed to move forward in this process. And so we were all healing throughout this process. And like I said earlier, engaged in the work continuously as essential workers. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that we learned early on is that the scale and the items of the scale, in which Anna is going to talk more about in a few minutes, were an opportunity for folks to engage in conversations about those questions that were posed in the scale. And folks started to immediately say that this process in itself of taking the scale was healing for them, because they had never thought about these questions in the way and never had a space and an opportunity to conversate and discuss what these aspects of getting to the core and reclaiming possibility meant for them. And so these community discussions, also started to produce ways in which folks could use the scale outside of just a pre and post test, how to use it to develop programming, how to develop programming that can lead to the outcomes that were identified in the scale. And so we recently created a companion discussion guide as one of the later phases in this process of disseminating information, but kind of honoring what we heard early on so that folks can utilize the scale in ways that allows them to engage in that same type of healing conversation, that healing-centered conversation that we heard from early on in the process. Next slide. And so now I am going to pass it on to my dear friend, colleague, sister warrior, Dr. Anna Ortega-Williams.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I just want to, again, I want to thank you for the relationships that you brought to the table to help design this scale. What I think is so powerful about this process is that it was understanding that science can be grounded in deep relationship. Science doesn't have to be extractive. It doesn't have to be reductionistic. Science can include the whole, and in a way that moves knowledge that has historically been marginalized to the center. So these partnerships that common justice as a whole has established over years created this scale. And so again, I just think it's really important when we think about science as midwifery, science as ceremony. That was the process that we were engaged in. And that's how we got robust and rigorous results. Just want to hold that. As I saw people come into the chat and say where you're from, I saw so many states, so many communities, so many blocks represented from across not just the United States, but also internationally, I just saw. So just imagine being able to have a tool that you know is reliable, that's valid, that has been informed by community wisdom and lived experience, and know that that is what can guide a conversation towards healing. To me, as a social scientist, as a social worker, as a youth worker, as someone born and raised in public housing, all of those experiences come to bear on the scientific process. And so we were able to use an asset-oriented approach to science and to scale testing. Next slide, please. So when we think about who participated, we had over 300 participants. And who were they? They were after-school program staff. They were participants. They were people that our community partners met with on the street. This is again during the height of the pandemic, in the wintertime in New York City and across our partner areas. So just if we could just hold that for a moment when we say 300 participants, they held events to recruit and to bring people to the conversation, as well as go to where community actually was already engaged in that kind of conversation. So I think, again, recruitment being an integral part of testing. We didn't just have students who were participating from elite universities, for example. These were people who were living their daily lives, who were also people who experienced push out from schools, who were also unemployed at some portion of the group. So again, it's just understanding that there were multiple hardships that people were facing while they engaged in this conversation. So just want to lift up the deep work that went into the relationships to engage people to participate. And of course, what we heard in our conversations with people while they were, after they took the scale, confirmed just what we had learned in our literature review that we engaged in. We were able to see the internal consistency and the reliability of the scale, which received what in scale testing science is a high bar. The Cronbach's alpha was 0.9. We know that most of the validated instruments that we use, that is considered, that's considered the line in the sand. Did this test well? But our process had multiple forms of rigor. So not only did it have to pass a statistical test, it also had to pass the test of the young person who then gave us feedback. Did the wording make sense? We had focus groups after the testing, so after the test, so that young people would be able to tell us like which words were clear, what wasn't. So we went from a scale that had over like a certain number of items in the beginning when we were originally designing the scale, from over 100 items to having a scale that had under 40. So again, it was through an iterative process that we were able to develop this. We can go to the next slide. And so, again, the purpose of this first testing was to see, did we understand, did we get the definition right? Did we define healing? Did we define community violence in a way that was reflective of the conversations that we had? And so we originally predicted 2 categories of healing: getting to the core and reclaiming possibilities and hope. And again, this came out of our literature review, came out of our best practices, came out of our study. But we saw that in the EFA that there were 4 categories. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and sit and try to understand, why did certain items from the scale hang together? What was the glue? And again, the scale passed through another layer of scrutiny of the community partners. And so we were able to interpret, because again, with scale testing and development, it isn't objective. There's so many layers of interpretation. So we were able to, again, make sense of the categorization of the items to then understand that in addition to getting to the core, and in addition to reclaiming possibilities and hope, we were able to see that there was faith in the healing process as a category of healing from community violence, and also trusting the community in healing. So these 4 domains, these 4 categories of healing, that's what showed up for the participants. And so in our so we tested it again. So we can go to the next slide. And this is just an example from the scale where you get to see our response categories. We can go to the next slide. What we were able to do was understand again and define what these categories were. And so when we tested the scale again for a confirmatory factor analysis, what we were testing for the second time was not just if this definition was correct, but how did this scale perform? Did it hold up with another test? Did those same 4 categories emerge again? And so we were able to see that not only did they emerge again, they had comparable relationships with standardized instruments that already exist, that are already widely used in our community. So it validated this scale for a second time. So not only did we get face validity from the community, whether when they said yes or no to an item, we also statistically had significant results twice. And so to us, that helps us understand that these 4 categories are ones that we could typically see on the healing journey. And so for us, it was an opportunity to understand what relationship did community healing have, for example, to depression. And for our scale, there was an inverse relationship in this particular sample with healing and depression. When healing was going up, depression was going down. That's amazing information to have if you're working with someone one-to-one or in a group. We also were able to see for hope. When healing went up, hope went up. So our scale had a direct relationship with other really important experiences that participants could have. And so again, for us to have 3 levels of testing, 1, just to see if those definitions actually stuck, 2, to see if those categories actually held together with the second testing, and then 3, to see how it performed in comparison to other measures. It's very powerful to see that kind of result. We can go to the next slide. And so instead of just telling you about the scale, I'll show you a couple of the items and how it connected to the component. So for example, getting to the core, just being able to face past pain so that one could heal their pain, or forgiving oneself for the harm that they have caused others. In a reflection conversation, we were able to hear young people to say, for example, from Homeboy, that you're not the only one who's gone through stuff. Just getting to hear that, getting to have that discussion was so powerful. Just knowing again that not only could you get to the core, but it was possible to witness someone else getting to the core of their pain and it be inspiring. We can go to the next slide. So reclaiming possibilities and hope. I recognize that I deserve to heal. I do my part so future generations will not go through the harm I went through. It was so important to hear from participants to understand that while taking this scale, while reflecting on their own healing journey, they were able to recognize when they didn't feel this way. They were able to recognize when wanting someone to feel the pain that was caused to them was a part of their journey, and that as they began to heal, they had less of that desire, less of that feeling. So for us, noticing that reclaiming possibilities and hope was an integral part of healing was a profound opportunity to develop insight into the journey. We can go to the next slide. So faith in healing. I know that hurting someone else is not going to fix my pain, and I choose relationships that support my healing. There was one participant that said it was really painful to think about the pain that they've been through. It was difficult to answer some of these questions, but it gave them the language that they needed to articulate the healing that had happened. So how powerful was it that they were able to, not only gain the words, but then also gain an opportunity to validate what they had experienced. We can go to the next slide. And lastly, trusting community and healing. I'm connected to a community supportive of my choice to heal. I'm able to use my experience to help others and myself heal. And Richard, I remember this moment when we had the discussion group between youth in New York and youth in LA, in Harlem and LA. And I remember one young person saying, I don't like scales. I don't want to take scales, but to be able to use this as an opportunity to hear what someone else has gone through, open something up for me. To me, I think that has deep implications in our work, in terms of how we assess change and how we measure healing. It isn't linear. Healing isn't linear. It's multidimensional, and there's an opportunity to determine healing outside of even just using the scale as a direct assessment, but also something that can spark healing in terms of the recognition and the imagination that is required for healing, that healing can be possible for someone. We can go to the next slide. So I will pass it back to Richard to talk a bit about the practical uses for the skill. And just again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Anna. So first and foremost, I want to lift up the young people, the people who were part of this process, who took the time, the young people in Harlem, the young people in LA, the people who were the ones that were recruited. I know several of the young people who are currently going through the healing process, experiencing harm, lost their lives. I want to lift them up. And one of the other things I want to do is I want to emphasize the meaning of the name. So we were very intentional about calling this scale the community's scale, the healing possibility. Because one thing that we were very certain of is that this was not our scale. We were just used for the purpose of bringing it into fruition. But this is something that came through the legacy of all of the healers that existed in Black and Brown communities. Because one thing that I know is that healing is not an option for Black and Brown folks. It is a part of our reality. So we have to have the ability to reclaim possibility. We have to be able to have faith in the healing process. And we have to have trust in our community in order to heal, right? And the other thing that I wanted to lift up is the fact that, and you can go to the next slide, is the fact that many of our partners who were participating in this process throughout in its entirety, many of them were organizations who were not receiving funding on a large scale like other organizations that were doing work with our young people. Many of them were two-man shows, one-woman shows that were deeply committed to the healing journey of young people who were directly impacted and experiencing harm in their community. And so we were also thinking about the importance of us defining it for us, because it is a part of who we are and how we have to live in this reality. We have to define healing for ourselves. And then we also have to lift up the practices that we engaged in historically that kept us alive under tremendous attacks on our community in order to be here today, in order for Anna and I to be in a position, for Alexis and I, all of us to be in a position to produce something as amazing as we did. And so I want to lift that up, because when we think about restorative justice circles, when we think about healing circles, when we think about these efforts being led by survivors, that is a part of the legacy. That is us honoring the healers who came before us, who healed so we can be in this position. And what we're doing is we're giving this offering. So yes, I've talked about the way that we can use it as a pre and post assessment. We did not want it to be solely that. We knew it had potential for much more than that. Yes, we can talk about how it can improve programming, but we really are lifting up the traditional practices that Black and Brown folks have engaged in as a means to survive for many, many years. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia to talk a little bit more about the platform 3C that we're using. I also want to just say really quickly before passing it over that this information is going to be accessible, and even the community discussion guide and all of these other things that we described. We're in the process of developing a website, and oh, Cynthia, don't let me know if I'm taking your part. But you know, in the spirit of participatory, in the spirit of really lifting up the voices and allowing the people who are directly impacted to lead the show, the website itself is actually being developed by young people from the programs, and more specifically, young people who are working with Dr. Bruce Purnell and the Love More movement. Cynthia?
Thanks, Richard. That's it, isn't it? That it, in the spirit of participatory action research. Right now, young people, particularly as you said, Richard, young people with the Love More movement are leading the development of a soon-to-be live website that will host the measure as well as other resources designed to help people, programs, and communities better understand and support the dynamic process of healing from violence. Richard and I were talking about this last Friday. Resources on the website will include, and perhaps not be limited to, training and coaching as needed, particularly to ensure that the scale is administered and used in a supportive environment. A supportive environment that responds and validates to strong emotions that can arise from participants as part of the healing process and as part of taking the scale and answering the questions on the scale, as you lifted up, I think, so eloquently, Anna. The website that young people from the Love More movement are developing now, the website that will host not just the healing scale, but other resources, will also, in fact, include a link to a cloud-based administration platform for the measure for the community scale for healing from violence possibilities. Another Casey grantee, the 3C Institute, is working with project partners right now, all the folks that Richard has been talking about, to customize the look and feel of a platform that 3C hosts called Quest. So they're customizing that right now so that the look and feel of navigating through the survey and answering the questions is aligned with the values of the project. This is a HIPAA compliant platform, and it will include automated data analysis and data dashboard visualizations for programs that use the survey. And so those could be visualizations that could be used at the individual program participant level, as well as at the aggregate data dashboard visualization level for programs that support healing from violence. And there will be no charge for accessing the survey and the healing measure. That said, I will turn it over to Danielle now to do what she does so well, which is inspire us.
I feel like we've been adequately inspired by my extraordinary colleagues today, but I'll take a moment to talk about the impact we hope the healing scale will have. We came to this work, not just with the framing I shared at the beginning about the ways in which we couldn't measure healing effectively where it took place, but an understanding of what the lack of measures meant for what work was resourced, what work grew, what leaders were elevated. Richard talked about people who were working like 50 hours a week for 10 hours a week of pay. Like, that's not, that might be noble, but it's not right? Like, people should be paid living wages for transformative work, and organizations doing the best work should be adequately staffed. And very often what we know to be true is that, changing what we measure changes what we regard as good work. And so if the only measures are the ones we knew before, it meant all of this other transformative work was in many respects unmeasurable. And it meant that the organizations doing this work couldn't prove to funders and others the efficacy of what they were doing. That meant that all the Black and Brown-led organizations that are deeply embedded in community, that are led by people with lived experience, by people who have survived and committed violence, by people who have buried their children, by people who have survived violence in the streets and the prisons of our nation, all of that, like, transformative work, typically doesn't excel on the measures that assume much more institutional, much narrower approaches of existing evidence-based practices that stand up to existing instruments that don't understand any of the dimensions that we've talked about earlier. And so we knew that those organizations and leaders have long been systematically under-resourced. And part of what we hope is that this instrument, of course, will center healing at the, it will allow us to actually measure healing as an inherent value, as something that people deserve, not just because healed people don't commit new crimes, which is usually how we get to talk about the efficacy of healing for Black and Brown folks in America, but because people deserve to heal in because they are human beings, because we as humans are deserving of healing, not simply to ensure that we don't transmit trauma to others, but because our own trauma matters, right? That we believe that the redistribution of resources will support community healing, and that the scale can be a lever for that, should it point to the efficacy of these organizations doing such transformative work, and give them a lever to demonstrate that efficacy to people who move money. And then that way, our hope is that measuring and recognizing healing in this way stands a chance to advance racial equity, not just within the organizations that use it, but for us as a movement, as a community. Because we know that changing these definitions redistributes power, that it can redistribute resources, that it can elevate and grow more healing work. And so our vision for this is that it not only is useful to programs that deserve it, but that it provides a tool to those programs in making the case for the resources for their work that ultimately will have a transformative effect for all of us. And so I know we have a lot of questions in a little time, and so I will stop there and pass it back to our moderators.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna and Richard and Danielle. We're so grateful for the work that all 7 partner organizations have put in over the past 3 years to develop this amazing and innovative scale. Here are, just as I reflect on this, here are a few takeaways from me. Healing from community violence is a non-linear journey. It's a dynamic rather than a static experience. Young people I've been learning from on a couple of other projects that I'm working with, they keep reminding me about this all the time, particularly when we talk about well-being, and they tell me it's not about well-being, it's about well-becoming. It's not a static achievement, it's a process. I also take away from this that exposure to community violence is rarely a one and done experience. It's part of systemic and interpersonal violence. And healing from community violence includes the ongoing practice of healing oneself, supporting healing among others, and the community at large from multiple forms of community violence. And finally, that the scale is a valuable tool and can serve multiple purposes that have many functions in people's lives.
Can I also just say, I just really appreciate you, Cynthia, and the Annie Casey Foundation for the support to do this, because I saw one of the questions in the chat. Someone said, there's almost like a tyranny of evidence. Like the evidence that's there's certain types of evidence that then becomes the baton, that then someone needs to comply to. And so I just think that it's very powerful to design evidence with participants in mind and in leadership as also co-researchers. I think that that's really a valuable practice that I really applaud this foundation for doing, so that the kinds of evidence that gets lifted to the surface and centered also validates what's already being done, like Danielle said.
Thank you for that, Anna. There are so many great questions that my colleague Ann is handing me. I know we won't get to all of them, but we'll move into Q&A now. And this is what I really enjoy about working with Anna and Danielle and Richard. I'll just put the questions out there, and you guys work so well together. Just jump in and answer. I think there were several themes, and one of the questions and one of the themes was the idea of how can the scale be used to help a community heal, not just an individual. And that really resonated with me, particularly given the very intentional name that you gave the measure. I wonder if any of you have some thoughts you want to share about that.
Could you repeat the question, please, one more time?
Sure. How can the scale be used to help a community heal, not just an individual?
I think I mean, we touched on it quite a bit thus far, right? From even like the community discussion guide and just like the way that, you know, we went through this process of engaging in listening sessions or focus groups. But even when we think about, you know, the domain that, you know, trusting community and healing. So yes, it's an individual journey, but again, going back to the reality that for Black and Brown folks, healing is not an option. It is something that we have to do because of our lived reality in this world. That inevitably healing will occur in community, right? It's not just a matter of just taking a pre and post to determine the outcomes or the impact of an intervention. It's engaging in conversations. It's opening the door for conversations in spaces that are brave, that allows us to identify the similarities in our journeys, the similarities in our experiences, and the ways that we can support each other in this process. And quite frankly, that's something that has been, you know, been done, you know, well before the scale has. So I think how can it be used to heal in community is the same way that, you know, especially Black and Brown folks have been healing in the community for as long as I can remember, we can remember.
So I think similar maybe to that question is a question about what groups will this likely work for? This being the scale, I think. What groups will this likely work for? And how do we apply the lessons to other people too? Any thoughts on that, folks?
Anna and I are staring at each other on Zoom. I'll pass it to Anna in a second, but I think, you know, there's these gold standard research methods behind this, right? Which means that it's validated for a certain population. And Anna and Richard are able, they talk like regular human beings, but the research behind it is as wonky and high level as one would ever expect in terms of where it's validated. That said, of course, we know that the ways people heal in intergenerational contexts. People heal from intertwined trauma. The way one heals from community violence and the way one heals from domestic violence is not inherently different. And so we would anticipate new iterations of this to emerge. We would anticipate for it to be available in other languages. There'd also have to be a shift to make sure it reflected other cultural contexts. We would anticipate groups like the one that created this could work with this scale and develop something else that actually made sense for their communities and for their contexts. And so in addition to it being available on the website, we're also, you know, publishing it in the most open and expansive way possible, like in a way that allows people, that prevents other people from monetizing the scale so that no one else can go copyright it and charge people to learn it in a way that the resources don't return to the people who created it, like the young people who participated, but we'll publish it in a way that supports those kinds of iterations developing. As places adapt it for the context, and folks who are working in these communities, like I imagine you'll see immediately some things that you're sure will resonate and others that you have curiosities about. And our team, I think, like the lessons I've learned from them is you'll best learn which things work in relationship and in shared wisdom with the folks whom are experiencing that violence. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that one.
Yes, I would say it, like I saw it connects also to another comment I saw in the chat about that understanding that trauma transcends race and ethnicities. I would assert that it's not that it transcends it, but we went into a deep dive around those lived experiences. And I think also there have been scales that have been used that have been validated with people of only one racial group or one class even, and that have been broadly used. And so I think there's an opportunity for people to, again, to use the scale and to continue to build the evidence around the scale to see who else it would also benefit. And so knowing that this is only, again, like Danielle said, a starting place, so knowing that it has validity is something that people can use across even age, because again, our sample prioritized young people, young adults, but also there was a range, an age range to whom it was given. So just wanted to offer that.
And I think you both touched on this. There were some other questions about, will it be translated into other languages, and can it also be used with middle-aged and older adults? So I think you both got at that as well. Anything else that you three want to bring to this conversation? You incredibly inspiring three folks. If you have any last words for us, I think I'll close this out with a little bit of information about the next Leading with Evidence webinar. Please feel free. Great. All right, everyone. Well, that's it for our presentation today. We're very grateful that you chose to spend part of your day with us. I know you're all very busy. And hopefully, Anna and Richard and Danielle have inspired you to support the healing process in your various roles and in your various communities. Our next Leading with Evidence webinar will go live in the second quarter of 2024. More to come about that in the coming months. If you have questions about how to access the survey or questions about wanting to use the survey or get more involved with this, please feel free just to reach out to me directly at cweaver@aecf.org, and I will coordinate making connections for you with the folks on this panel who can most easily answer your questions and link you up with using the scale. So again, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you probably sometime in June with the next Leading with Evidence webinar. And remember, everyone, we will be sending out the slide deck for this webinar, the recording of this webinar, and if there are any questions that we could not get to today in Q&A, we will also send out answers to those questions as well. So stay tuned. Have a great rest of the day, everyone, and thank you for joining us today.